Hey guys, Drifter here, and welcome back to Bedside Media. Since September, it seems like we can't even go 2 weeks without South Park stirring up some kind of news headline. South Park, after securing a staggering $1.5 billion deal from Paramount, the parent company of Comedy Central, has hit the ground running with this season, constantly staying on top of the weekly onslaught of news, which they've always been known to do. What came as a surprise, however, is how dedicated Trey Parker and Matt Stone have become to covering the Trump administration, especially after saying the previous summer that they were going to be done with Trump and done covering politics and all that sort of stuff. So when asked about the switch up in a New York Times interview, Trey Parker would give the headline quote of, "It's not that we got all political, it's that politics became pop culture." The quote hit me at first as a kind of weak justification, but after some thought, it really did start to sink in how much pop culture has become political. Even thinking about how much the show has changed and progressed in its history almost makes it evident in and of itself, but it's not just South Park. The media in our culture has become increasingly political as audiences have now become more eager and more willing to consume media that have clear political points of view. So today I thought it would be worth talking about media in general rather than a review, and to see if we can learn something about the nature of the relationship to artist and audience and how they mutually shape the cultural zeitgeist. I'm going to be mainly using South Park as a way to track the shift of tastes, since this obviously is what got me thinking about the topic, but also because they have been around for such a long time and have always managed to stay on top of the pulse of our culture. We will be talking about some other shows as they will be relevant, but with that preamble out of the way, let's get started. Firstly, it's useful for our purposes to understand how politics used to be talked about back in the 90s or even before that. For my younger audience, you may not know what it was like to only be able to watch the TV you wanted when it was bound to a strict schedule set in place by studio companies. You would have to go out of your way to learn what channel a show you were interested in was being hosted on, what time slot it was going to play on, and that is assuming you even had the money for cable in the first place, and assuming the show wasn't public broadcast, because if you missed it, well, you just kind of missed it. And if you didn't have a TV guide, you wouldn't even know what episode would be playing. It would be completely roulette. It could be random stuff at any given time. Movies are similar beasts. Obviously, you had more of a window to make time for it, and it was considered more of a social activity, whereas TV wasn't. You had to have money, not just for the ticket, but also for the gas or bus fare if your local theater wasn't within walking distance. The point being that to engage with a lot of media, it took significant, or at least pointed effort from the consumer to even spend their money on whatever show or movie they wanted to see. Because at the end of the day, companies wanted to make a profit. Even the ones that truly cared about making good art still needed to make a profit. And anyone who spends Thanksgiving with their family knows that usually politics can be a divisive issue. It used to be considered risky when making shows or movies that weren't explicitly about politics, examples being All the President's Men, certain biopics, The West Wing, etc. But think about a movie like Top Gun. The movie is about the Air Force and the US military, but it oddly isn't really political. It's more of like an action-adventure movie for the main focus, and the political dressing of it is to ensure the function of the story it wants to tell and not to have perhaps a moral lesson or point. This is not a criticism for going this route, but rather to illustrate that unless the story is explicitly about politics, any association with politics at the time was largely illusory. The same goes for television. While a lot of sitcoms like Friends and Seinfeld and Full House would all make a political joke every now and then, the joke itself would be so broad in its structure that it could be considered edgy at worst and inoffensive at best.
What are you doing with the Daily Worker?
Your Ned must have left it here.
Your boyfriend reads the Daily Worker? What is he, a communist?
He reads everything, you know. Ned's very well read.
Maybe he's just very well read.
They often function on the audience knowing only the vaguest points of whatever the political landscape is at the time, to where any voting age adult would be likely to get the punchline. Even shows like The West Wing, which is obviously about government and about as political as it can get in terms of story, tended to be very down the middle on a lot of issues. The president of the show, while a liberal, is often the first one to side with the opposition party at times, if not directly spouting their talking points on occasion. I think the show sidesteps a lot of the pitfalls that a show like this can have by appealing more generally to American values as a whole and to the beauty of democracy. Skip Intro, on his 3-part essay on The West Wing, has a really good section, I think, that talks about this tendency to be bipartisan in a lot of its messaging in his video series about the show. And if you're interested in a big West Wing breakdown, I can't recommend it enough. But back to the main topic. The main place at the time that people were watching TV and wanted to engage with politics as a form of entertainment would be late-night TV shows. A format stretching all the way back almost to the birth of TV, late-night shows were considered to be something of a darling in the industry for an extremely long period of time. They were able to comment on a wide facet of the goings-ons of life, and not just politics, but musicians, actors, directors, authors, as well, of course, politicians. So to make it to late night TV was essentially to arrive in pop culture, even if that was your 15 minutes of fame. To underestimate the influence of late night hosts, I think would be a grave mistake for understanding how a lot of public sentiment is forged and solidified in our collective consciousness prior to the internet culture. A good promotion segment for a guest would help turn an average movie into a box office success, or maybe make a New York Times bestseller, or even help make or break political ambitions in the court of public opinion.
Sometimes foreshadowing is relatively obvious.
So what changed? While late night TV is still around, it's far less popular than it was before. Movies and TV shows are far more willing to be upfront about the politics that they want to engage in, especially contemporary politics. So if the traditional wisdom of the industry was to avoid eschewing people due to being too political, why haven't they completely lost the marketplace? Well, 2 major things happened around the turn of the century. The first is 9/11.
Chaos in New York at the moment. There have been not one but 2 incidents, as Charlie and Diane have so ably reported so far. The second one coming at 9:03.
Oh yes, we're going there. We're going to be talking about 9/11 today. It cannot be overstated how much everything changed for people after the terror attacks on the Twin Towers. It affected not just Americans, but the world at large. But for our discussion today, we're going to keep it focused on how did it impact media being created. Well, the people that create our movies and TV shows are just like the rest of us and wanted to process the collective trauma we all endured in the aftermath of the attack. This resulted in a slew of references to 9/11, if not full-blown episodes. South Park famously was one of the first TV shows to actually tackle the issue when they returned from season 5's mid-hiatus on November 7th. That was, of course, after That's My Bush got canceled. So while their return episode is mostly apolitical in tone, it was one of the rare times that they would dive into something as political as this. Again, most of the time when they would reference politics, they would be in offhand quips, and the only episodes I can think of in earlier seasons were Big Gay Al's boat ride in season 1, maybe Cartman's silly hate crime in season 4, and they talk about hate crime laws that in a way that obviously didn't age super well.
Because all crimes are hate crimes. If a man beats another man because that man was sleeping with his wife, is that not a hate crime?
And Chef Goes Nanners in the same season about the Confederate flag controversy was also going on. But besides Big Gay Al's boat ride, these are not considered classic episodes, probably due in part to them being a little on the nose about the politics of the situation. Though I would argue that in more recent years, Osama bin Laden Has Farty Pants has become more of a classic, which leads me into why I think 9/11 changed how a lot of people will tolerate politics in their media. Something that also stuck with me when listening to the commentary track on this episode from the season 5 box set, Matt and Trey talk about their entire break was spent talking about what was happening in the news in the wake of the attacks.
Like, 9/11 happened, and basically we were all supposed to be taking trips to different places. It was sort of, we had ended a South Park run, and we all had kind of different vacations planned, and they all got put on hold. And we kept sort of hanging out together, because just like everyone else, we were just sort of wanting to hang out with our friends, and we would constantly talk about, what are we going to do on set? Like, we have to do a South Park episode in like 5 weeks. What are we going to do? And our show is the show, if any show would do it, we would just talk about basically what happened.
Sounding very similar to how they described how they spent their summer leading up to this season about the fallout of Trump's re-election. Not trying to say that this re-election was as bad as 9/11, but in my own personal opinion, it was quite bad. But the way they processed the outcome feels very much the same. 9/11 was so broadly affecting and impactful in such a way that it was truly unifying to Americans. At least in those early days before the Iraq invasion, I remember churches were full. We basically sold out of American flags. There was this incredible amount of social cohesion that I've never seen again in my entire lifetime. And a lot of that was able to bypass anti-political sentiment that people would normally have. The only other examples I can think of like this would probably be things like the Pearl Harbor attack, maybe JFK and RFK assassinations. And a lot of shows would be able to use this general acceptance to talk about 9/11 explicitly. I don't want to get too bogged down on 9/11 in particular because it's a grim topic, but if that sounds like something that's interesting to you, I can highly recommend Lindsay Ellis's 2-part series about 9/11 and the media that came out about it. It's highly informative and interesting, at least for people like me. And I would hope that you would find that interesting as well. But back to the main topic, you can now start to see the attitude change in what people were willing to watch, at least in terms of if it had political angles in it or not. South Park in particular would start to dip their toes more into political topics in later seasons, even revisiting 9/11 2 more times. We would get episodes about woke culture going all the way back to 2005 with the Death Camp of Intolerance. My lord, what a title. Commentary on immigration with the time-traveling goobacks. There was the sex reassignment surgery and Mr. Garrison's fancy new vagina. So while South Park was a show that was definitely more willing to pick up that kind of mantle and be more politically focused, a lot of the general positive sentiment started to turn on the Bush administration in his second term, with Americans becoming disillusioned with not finding weapons of mass destruction of Iraq, and a lot of audiences were being primed to be more willing to engage in discussions about the government at the time. I want to stress here that we're avoiding the elephant in the room about news outlets, but that's outside the scope of this discussion, as well as music and pop culture. But the second point we need to talk about that feeds into the first is what I would imagine most of you were expecting, and that's the rise of the internet. People could now use their time consuming new media online that catered to whatever they wanted to partake in. And don't get me wrong, it's not like it was overnight in that early part of the 2000s, but once we started getting into the last few years of the decade, YouTube would open its doors to the world, Netflix would begin sending DVDs to their subscribers and later streaming to home, Xbox was streaming movies and stuff like that, Amazon was starting to become the world's leading bookstore, and people could finally get the media they wanted in more direct ways than was previously possible, and for much cheaper as well. Before, as stated, you'd have to make an effort to see what you wanted at the studio's discretion or fork over some serious cash to buy niche VHSs or DVDs or box sets, even Laserdiscs on occasion for rare things. But now people were able to enjoy content that was curated specifically to their taste, as rough as it may have been production-wise, and while the algorithms weren't like the ones we have today, these new companies were still motivated to keep your business as much as possible. And any moment that you're spending time with them is a moment that you're not giving to a competitor. Speaking of 2008 and the rise of YouTube, this gave politicians a new way to access the culture in ways that were gated in traditional media. The social media aspects of YouTube, in a way, have kind of fallen to the wayside, but Obama gets a lot of credit for utilizing not just YouTube, but the rise of new media to promote his 2008 and 2012 campaigns. While he was definitely a young and charismatic choice to a lot lot of people during his time. I think if not for the audience being primed to accept having contemporary politics and politicians in their media diet, his online campaign strategy might not have panned out as well as we think about it now. Not saying it would have cost him the election, but it was a contributing factor in his win, undoubtedly. And the internet not being regulated as TV or radio had been in previous decades certainly helped as well. When we start to get to 2012 in particular, and YouTube has reached newfound heights of influence, you can really see the impact of politics in this newfound medium. Several big YouTubers are starting to find themselves just as important as pop culture figures, especially for the youth, and are platforming various politicians for the first time ever. Just think about the YouTube debates. Wow, what a wild and fun disaster that was. But I can think of several videos like this one where YouTubers are essentially creating the prototype that podcasters in their boom in the coming years would ultimately mimic. And while I think it may have been divisive in a sense, these were popular videos with respectable views for the time and doing the same job that late night TV talk show hosts do, and are slowly becoming the people who shape pop culture. TV media would slowly start becoming the ones mimicking what's already popular rather than helping forge it for themselves. The takeaway from these 2 points about 9/11 and the rise of the internet is that they were both forces that put pressure on consumer and pop culture that forged a new zeitgeist. Movies and TV shows could be more upfront about contemporary topics without being just about politics themselves. Things that already were political in tone could be more critical of the current dichotomy of the government, and audiences would not inherently just disengage from it. It was no longer taboo to be upfront and partisan, but it still had to be entertaining, and if you were mainstream media, up to some degree of quality. Internet could be anything. The rise of the internet, with an audience more willing to accept and discuss said politics, were able to curate their own tastes in media that fit with what they wanted to watch or read. While the quality may have been lower, it did have its own positives in terms of being more relatable and also able to produce content a lot faster than the traditional Hollywood system. Politicians, sensing the changing ways that people are getting their news and opinions from, are starting to utilize this to their advantage and to be able to reach more people more directly than ever before, and this wave of change would continue to build and build, and by 2016, things would start to catch on like wildfire.
Sorry, not sorry. It's time for someone to say it like it is and make our country great again.
So by this point, the internet is in full swing. Tumblr and 4chan are at their heights of popularity, respectively, in creating political bubbles and memes that are disseminating out into the further reaches of the web, and by proxy into pop culture. Reddit's near stranglehold as the front page of the internet is starting to have its own fall of the Roman Empire moment. Twitter has now become the new town square, as people would have called it, and legacy media is in full catch-up mode all the time, trying to keep up with what's even relevant.
Damn, Daniel. Damn, Josh. Okay.
Partisan politics have started to become fertile breeding grounds for comedy and plots in television like Rick and Morty.
God damn it, when did this shit become the default?
And of course, South Park. So in season 19, we finally get our first, albeit lightly serialized season, that is to say, not episodic. There is an actual narrative to follow from episode to episode. Previous seasons had touched on more illicitly political situations like the NSA links or the Zimmerman shooting, but now in season 15, every episode is talking about the rise of woke culture, and South Park's role in a pop culture has rapidly evolved since they first started airing. We're introduced to a new mainstay character in the PC Principal, a play on the term politically correct, who sums up quite succinctly the interrogations a lot of artists were starting to have about their own media and media in general.
I'm here because this place is lost in a time warp. Students who still use the word retarded. A teacher who said women without wombs should get an AIDS test. Oh, I was a lesbian then.
This season would go on to talk heavily about partisan issues such as trans visibility, gentrification, police shootings, police brutality, safe spaces, and all culminating in this overall arc about how maybe the biggest reason we're seeing this push of political correctness on the masses is to serve advertisers and capitalism at large so companies could increase their profits.
What is PC but a verbal form of gentrification? Spruce everything up, get rid of all the ugliness in order to create a false sense of paradise? Only one thing can actually live in that world: ads.
Which, if that isn't political, I at this point in the video, I don't even know what to say anymore. But this used to be a show that's cultural legacy were catchphrases and sound bites. Respect my authority. Hello, children. Hi, chef. Things like that. Which, to be fair, was a lot of TV shows' bread and butter at the time. You had to Eat My Shorts, Cool Whip, Dole, things like that for, like Homer Simpson, etc. It was, considered a way that you could measure the cultural impact of a show. And so I don't want to discredit South Park for being reflective of that time period, but it does go to show how our media started to really shift and turn into something much more partisan than ever before. Season 19 would also be considered by many as possibly one of the best seasons of the show. Both sides of the aisle found something to latch onto as enjoyable in the commentary they were crafting. The fact that it was their first serialized season garnered them a lot of respect for how they're still willing to shake things up and try new things after nearly 2 decades of being on the air with a proven formula, and this was just genuinely funny, as subjective as that might be. Not even to mention the rise of streaming being the preferred way to watch content now, and their ratings would climb after that season before a little decline starting towards season 21 as the streaming wars began to really kick off. Shows in general at this time were more willing to address topics that would have been left to the background of the matter in the past. I think Brooklyn Nine-Nine is a good example. While most shows wouldn't really get too deep into the politics of being a cop show, besides very basic facts about cops, they would have episodes and moments addressing evolving narratives of policing in modern America, and even branch out into some ancillary topics such as LGBTQ sexuality. Audiences not only are no longer politically avoidant, but are now increasingly hungry for media that appeases their political sensibilities. The Ghostbusters remake was probably the movie that really exposes this new trend to me, and while I don't think the idea of it being like, what if the Ghostbusters were women, is super revolutionary, the fact that it initially created an outrage, both from people who thought it was pointless and also outrage amongst those people who wanted to defend it against criticisms just out of principle, sort of wanting to defend women. I think that this proves the growing sense of political expectations in media that the audiences are wanting to consume in pop culture. Ghostbusters being a remake of an 80s property, and the fact that the actual all-females Ghostbusters movie was not a very good movie probably didn't help it, and we could do an entire video on that. But 2016 led us to the point where politics were an ever-constant focal point in our entertainment. We started getting shows like Atlanta that focused a lot on race in America with Donald Glover. Billions would be introduced to the first non-binary character played by Asia Kate Dillon, who is non-binary in real life. And Orange is the New Black is the current streaming darling, a comedy drama series that focuses on the stories of women in the prison system. South Park would carry the momentum from season 19 and do a whole season about a certain campaign of a political candidate running for president. There's no avoiding talking about it. The 2016 general election between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton fundamentally would change the name of the game in a lot of ways. 2016, as forever ago as that feels, was considered at the time to be an absolutely god-awful year. There were lots of beloved celebrities like Alan Rickman and David Bowie that would pass away, terrible events both domestically and internationally, and the election season would boil down to having 2 candidates that were deeply unpopular, even by their own parties to some degree. I would argue that just like 9/11 previously, the stress of this year ended up with people seeking more catharsis than usual, especially when it came to the election cycle. And Donald Trump as a candidate was very much so unique in terms of the campaign he was running. Hillary was completely out of touch with most of the population, and while running what could be considered a traditional campaign, could not manage to tap into the internet culture of the moment, which resulted in her creating a lot of moments that would be mocked relentlessly.
Because we're going to have a lot of jobs from building infrastructure to coding, creating new apps. I don't know who created Pokemon Go, but I'm trying to figure out how we get them to have Pokemon go to the polls.
Donald Trump, however, was much more effective at tapping into this new landscape of internet memery and content creation, probably aided in no small part by Steve Bannon and the audience that he managed to curate. I actually made an entire video about this called How World of Warcraft Helped Trump Win, about Steve Bannon's involvement in early World of Warcraft and how his experience there shaped his advising on the Trump campaign, but that's a little bit outside the scope of this video. For now, the takeaway we need is that Trump was a great inflection point for a lot of traditional media to vent frustrations. Through laughter at how he was never going to win, or how he's a joke, or through Republicans being done for another 4 years. We were kind of used to decades of TV being the crafters of public sentiment, or at least having a final say on where the pulse was for the public, and the mainstream media was so confident that Clinton was going to win in a landslide, and...
Guess who's here? It's the President of the United fucking States.
And I think that took a lot of people by surprise. Even Matt and Trey seemed to be completely taken aback, at least according to the commentary track for the season. This also affected the outline they had for the season, which clearly had bet on Clinton winning to help resolve some of the other plot lines of the internet troll watchers, and sent the creators scrambling to make President Donald Trump work instead. This political upset would pretty much kill the serialized format for South Park for a long time, up until its latest season, but we'll get there soon enough. The election of Donald Trump would raise the temperature for a lot of people, so to speak, with his style of governance being vastly different than his predecessors before him, and a hyper-fixation on his actions. Politics became an almost inescapable force. Disengaging from the news cycle itself was no longer possible, as now YouTube and other social media algorithms would constantly bombard you with content that is catered to whatever set of politics would get you to interact with the platform the most. Edutainment and infotainment would also see a noticeable rise, a term that I mean content that blurs the line between being educational, informative, and entertaining, think something like The Daily Show. And it also became more easily accessible with the near omnipresence of YouTube and Spotify for podcasts. Traditional media was becoming much more explicit with their political themes during this time. Shows were more willing to engage with Black Lives Matter as a subject, LGBT rights, and various other left-wing positions as a form of resistance against this new, mostly right-dominated online media. I don't think it's a secret that a lot of Hollywood types tended to be on the left side of the aisle, but as previously discussed, they always had to walk a small tightrope to balance the artful expression with broad appeal to ensure that they could garner maximum profits, especially with budgets now ballooning to truly ridiculous proportions. Before, you could make small movies that had partisan angles and market them accordingly to possibly be a success in their own right, but now that audiences are in a state where politics are becoming increasingly visible in their day-to-day lives, this gave studios much more room to promote movies and shows that wear their politics on their sleeves. And it was still set to be profitable by finding a target demographic or even earning views from hate watchers, which would just give the movie more publicity somehow. Although South Park would no longer do serialized narratives, they would still remain heavily focused on the ever-evolving political environment. Mr. Garrison would be stuck as their Trump allegory, much to the chagrin of Matt and Trey, and about 60% of the season would touch on something almost too many to name. We had dead kids at school. We had time to get cereal. They apologized to Al Gore for calling him dumb about climate change. There's the Mexican Joker, where Trump cracks down on the border and is going to radicalize people into violence. There's Bored Girls, which is about transgender people in sports. And we even get Matt Stone quoting the Marxist theory of labor in the Amazon two-parter. I think it's fair to say that the times we find ourselves in, as the world becomes more interconnected than ever and we are more divided than ever, art is going to be reflective of what we're going through. A key example that comes to mind is when Roe v. Wade was overturned and we suddenly got a lot of body horror that specifically touched on themes of creatures bursting out of our body for roughly a year and a half, and also sort of female-centric horror. The anxieties that a lot of people were starting to have about not having a choice in their bodily autonomy led to the rise of the art that tackles that issue. As the first Trump term would wind down, we wouldn't even get the chance to act, as the pandemic would completely change our life for years. So just like 9/11 20 years prior, the impact of the coronavirus, fraying economy, and lockdowns would be a massive strain on everyone's mental and emotional health. With literally nowhere for people to go, being trapped inside, the demand for more and more content would bring a smorgasbord of offerings, and even further craft a lot of bubbles for people to comfortably make it through the next couple of years. Even South Park was broken by the effects of isolation from the pandemic, famously only dropping one special episode in 2020. Pandemic years more than we probably should, but just keep in mind, this goes to show a repeating theme that I'm trying to make sure a lot of you pick up on, which is that when the country goes through a collective trauma, we're going to gain a lot more politics in our media as we process the moment that we find ourselves in. And this brings us finally to today in late 2025. Kamala Harris lost her election, giving us the first president to serve non-consecutive terms since Grover Cleveland, and after spending 8 years as a target of traditional media ridicule and outcry, and possibly the last 4 years as being a political exile, at least in certain ways, Donald Trump has now decided to use his newfound mandate to begin pressing his thumb on the scale of media. Traditional media is now finding itself under fire in ways not thought possible in the modern age. Don't be mistaken, America has always had to wrestle with executive authority overreach on the First Amendment. The second president of the United States, John Adams, tried to infringe upon it with executive orders he passed before being overruled by the Supreme Court. Woodrow Wilson would try to silence anyone speaking against the military entering World War I with the Sedition Act, and famously sending Eugene Debs to prison over it. That being said, we find ourselves in a moment where saying the wrong thing about the current president, or anything that is not glowingly positive, is enough to warrant either a lawsuit or, even worse, a governmental action like denying a merger. At the end of the day, as I've said multiple times, these studios are companies, they are corporations, and they are designed to make money, and they've lost a lot of market share to online content, and right now they're desperately trying to find ways to stay competitive in today's media landscape. Mergers are becoming increasingly common, and due to antitrust laws, they require the government to finalize or approve certain mergers. This has companies scrambling to do whatever they can to appease the new administration in a desperate attempt to ensure their own economic stability via merger. Paramount in particular this year has gotten a lot of flack in trying to ensure its merger, with another one on the horizon soon from the sounds of it. So if the president, who doesn't like a certain late night show saying bad things about him, well...
and the ABC network are taking Jimmy Kimmel Live off the air indefinitely.
South Park, for better or worse, has always been a very centrist kind of show. They'll laugh at whatever they find funny, which is usually anything they feel is a form of extremism, And that's probably a big factor in their longevity. And because the average person is going to view far leftists as sort of like silly anarcho-communists and far rightists as sort of silly religious zealots, both of which being worthy of ridicule. That being said, the one hill that Matt and Trey Parker will absolutely die on is freedom of speech. During their 200th episode special, this singular belief was more on display than anything I've ever seen, as for the first time they were unwillingly censored by the network for wanting to depict the prophet Muhammad. So with both Colbert and Kimmel already having their shows fall victim to the pressures of the administration, it's no wonder that they would want to get into the ring to poke fun at Trump, but the fact that this season has garnered so much attention from news outlets and social media alike shows just how primed we are becoming to having to address contemporary politics in our favorite TV shows and movies, and don't forget about video games either. This particular season has become such a boon that the New York Times is reporting that other networks are changing schedules to avoid competing against South Park in the same time slot. Ultimately, I think Matt and Trey hit the nail on the head here. The last 25 years has rapidly shifted the way we create, find, and consume media. Audiences have become more and more accustomed, if not outright expecting, political theming in their consumption. What used to have to be subtext just to be made and widely promoted has now become explicit. The lines between what is educational and news and entertainment or infotainment have all broken down, becoming much murkier to tell apart. That same content is also more accessible to both create and access in ways that couldn't have even been thought of before the turn of the century. All you need now to make content is a phone, which everyone has, and a stable internet connection. Algorithms have become so advanced that they know how to keep you locked into watching as much content as possible and what views to present to you and which ones will cause you to log off and stop watching. Politicians, in ways that they could have only ever dreamed of, now have more direct access to you as individuals than they've ever had. And they can be the headline guest to any podcast with a desire to host them and an audience who will love them or hate them. Does this mean that we're forever doomed to have everything be political forever? I don't think so. Matt and Trey, in their newest episode at the time of recording, don't either. In a very self-aware episode, the creators talk about how the backlash the show has received for diving so far into the deep end of Trump this year, and while it works through some of those critiques, the episode ends on a kind of touching ending that I think will be worth keeping in mind as we close out this decade.
I guess there's just no really going back to the way things used to be. Things will get back, Stan. I know it's hard to see right now, but things will go back to normal. And in the meantime, we just have to make the most of where we are.
At the end of the day, we should be aware of the media we're consuming and the things that we're taking in and how we got here today, because the only constant in life is that there is no constant. There will always be change, and I'm certain that there will come a point again where the politically charged nature of our media will once again fade back into subtext. Guys, that's all for this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned something useful. This was a much more serious video than we've done in the past. But if you did enjoy, don't forget to like, subscribe, ring the bell, or just leave a comment. Drifter out.